I have carried a great many letters in my years as private secretary to the Duke of Wynthorpe, but I have never carried one that changed the course of a man's life so completely as the one I brought him on the morning of his grandmother's funeral. It arrived by the hand of Mr. Selden, the family's solicitor of 30 years, who appeared at the servants' entrance while the mourning guests were still removing their coats in the hall. I found him in the passage outside the study, holding a sealed envelope with the particular careful posture of a man who has been waiting to discharge a duty for some time. "She left instructions," he said, before I had spoken. "3 years ago, the first time her heart gave her trouble. She said I was to deliver this on the day of the funeral, not before and not after. Into the Duke's hands only." I took the letter, the Duchess's handwriting on the front, that small, precise script I had known since I entered service at Wynthorpe at the age of 22, read simply, "For Caspian. Open it now." I did not open it. I carried it upstairs. The Duke was in his study, standing at the window that looked over the rear garden. He had not sat down since early morning. I had worked for Caspian Aldermere, the 6th Duke of Wynthorpe, for 11 years, and I had never seen him sit when he was troubled. "From Mr. Selden," I said, "your grandmother's instructions." He took the letter, broke the seal, and read it. He read it a second time. Then he set it on the desk with the same controlled precision he applied to everything, and looked out the window again for a long moment. "Phineas," he said, which was unusual. He rarely used my given name except in private, and the study door was still open. "Who is Temperance Wren?" I did not know. I said so. "She is apparently employed at Ashburn Park," he said, "as a letter copyist and librarian. My grandmother met her in the garden of Ashburn 3 years ago, in the autumn, and formed an opinion." He paused. "She has written it down here at some length." I waited. "She says," the Duke continued, with the particular measured tone he used when reading aloud something that was requiring considerable self-command, "that Miss Wren is the only woman she has encountered in the last decade whom she would trust to make me argue, make me laugh, and make me, in her words, slightly less impossible to love." He set the letter down again. "She then says she is fully aware I will resist this, that resistance is futile, and that she has thought of 4 separate counter-arguments I am likely to make, and has addressed each of them on the 2nd page. There was a silence. "Had she?" I asked. "Yes," said the Duke, and something crossed his face that was not quite grief, and not quite amusement, and was, I think, simply the expression of a man who had loved someone very much, and was finding out, even now, that she had been several steps ahead of him. He asked for his horse before I had left the room. The estate of Ashburn Park sat 2 miles east of Wynthorpe Hall, across open farmland and a small wood. The Colwood family had held it for 4 generations. Lady Colwood, the current mistress, was a woman of 60, with a comfortable temperament and an excellent library, and she employed, as I subsequently learned, a young woman named Temperance Wren to catalogue, copy, and conserve her correspondence. I know all of this because I followed the Duke to Ashburn the following morning. He had not asked me to come. He had not told me where he was going, but I had been secretary to Caspian Aldermere long enough to know that when he rode out alone before breakfast, something was happening that I ought to be present to witness. He had done the same thing the day before, which I had noted, and filed away without comment, the way a good secretary files away everything that might later prove significant. I arrived in the Ashburn Library at 10:30, to find the Duke seated at the far end of the long table, with a leather-bound catalogue of correspondence open before him, and a young woman seated at the other end, writing. Neither of them looked up when I entered. The fire was low. Outside, the November light came through tall windows in the pale, thin way of late autumn, and the smell of the room was old paper and beeswax polish, and the faint trace of wood smoke. I took a chair by the door, and waited. Temperance Wren was perhaps 25, small-framed, with the particular composure of someone who has spent a great deal of time in rooms full of important people, and learned to become invisible. Her hair was dark and plainly dressed, pinned without ornament. Her gown was clean and well-made, but entirely practical. The gown of a woman who works with her hands and does not expect to be looked at. She worked without pause, copying in a clear hand, and when she reached the end of a page, she set down her pen, blotted it, and turned the sheet with the efficiency of long habit, all without lifting her eyes from the text. She had, beside her inkpot, a small dish of sand and a worn corner of linen for the nib, and she used both, with the automatic precision of someone who has been doing this since girlhood. "You've come back," she said, addressing the catalogue, and the Duke, who had indeed been there the afternoon before, said yes. "Did you find what you were looking for?" she asked. "Not yet," he said. She picked up her pen again. "Well, you are welcome to the library. Lady Colwood is in Bath until Thursday. I can answer questions about the collection if you have them, but I am a copyist, not an archivist. If you need something identified, I would wait for Mr. Fitch." "I don't need anything identified," said the Duke. "Then what do you need?" He looked at her for a moment. "I am not entirely sure," he said, which was, in 11 years of service, the first time I had ever heard Caspian Aldermere admit to uncertainty in the presence of another person. She did look up then. She had steady gray eyes, and she regarded him with the thoughtful patience of someone accustomed to letters that didn't say what they meant. "Your Grace," she said, "I am not a fool, and I suspect you are not one either. You are the Duke of Wynthorpe, which means you could have any library in 3 counties open to you on request. You came here yesterday on a courtesy call that lasted 4 hours, and you have come back this morning before I have finished my first cup of tea. I think you had better tell me plainly what it is you came to say." The Duke considered this. "My grandmother," he said, "left me a letter." Something moved in her face, very small, quickly managed. "I know," she said. "She told me she intended to." The silence that followed was the kind that changes the shape of a room. "She told you," the Duke said. "3 years ago, in the autumn. We spoke in the garden at Ashburn for perhaps 20 minutes, while she was visiting Lady Colwood. She was very direct." Temperance set down her pen and folded her hands on the table. She said she had decided to meddle, that she was 81 and had earned the right, and that she hoped I would not object to being meddled on behalf of. I told her I wasn't certain I had a view, since I didn't know you at all. She said that was precisely the point. The Duke looked at her for a long time. "Did she tell you what she intended to write?" "She told me she intended to make sure you came to find me," Temperance said. "She said the rest was my responsibility." He stood, then, and crossed the room. Not quickly, with none of the impatience that drove him in other contexts, but with the deliberate steadiness of a man who has made a decision and intends to see it through. He stopped at the near end of the table, which put him perhaps 6 feet from where she sat, and I thought of the Duchess, 3 years dead, and entirely correct. "She said you would not argue," Temperance said quietly. "I was going to argue," the Duke said. "I had 4 counter-arguments. She mentioned that. She addressed them on the 2nd page. She told me she would." Temperance looked up at him. "Were they good counter-arguments?" A pause. "No," said the Duke. "They were not." She held his gaze for a moment longer, and then she picked up her pen, which was the most composed thing I have ever seen a person do, and said, "Lady Colwood returns Thursday. If you want to call properly, you might wait until then. It would be more regular." "I have not been very regular about this so far," the Duke said. "No," she said, "you haven't. He came every day until Thursday. On Tuesday, he brought a volume from the Wynthorpe library that he thought she might find useful for the Colwood catalogue, which was thoughtful, and on Wednesday, he arrived in time for the midday meal and stayed until the light failed, which was less strictly a courtesy call and more simply a man who did not want to leave. I did not accompany him on either day. I had seen enough to know how the week would end, and a secretary who hovers ceases to be useful and becomes simply a witness to a private matter, which is a different thing entirely. On Thursday, Lady Colwood returned from Bath and received the Duke of Wynthorpe in her front drawing room, with the transparent delight of a woman who had been hoping for precisely this development for some time, which suggested to me that the late Duchess had been managing more than one piece of this arrangement. On Friday he proposed. He did it in the library, which was where all of it had begun, with Temperance standing by the window with an open catalogue in her hands, because she had not expected him to do it today, specifically, and he had not expected to do it today either, until he walked through the door and saw her and simply knew. I was not in the room. I will not pretend otherwise. But I was in the passage, and the walls at Ashburn Park are not particularly thick, and I heard him begin, and I heard her say yes before he had finished. The door opened. He looked at me with the expression of a man who has been caught eavesdropping on himself. "Phineas," he said. "Your Grace." She said yes. "I heard, Your Grace." He looked at the ceiling briefly. "How long have you been in the passage?" "Long enough," I said. A very small pause. "Good," he said, and went back inside. They were married in December, at the village church of St. Crispin's, Wynthorpe, on a morning of grey skies and thin frost. There were 14 guests. Lady Colwood wept openly, and without apology. The Duke's estate steward stood in the back pew looking quietly pleased. I stood up as witness, which was more than I had expected when I carried that letter upstairs on the morning of the funeral. At the wedding breakfast, which was held in the east parlour at Wynthorpe Hall, with a fire large enough to heat half the house, the Duke stood and produced the letter. He had not done so before, not to me, not to anyone. He unfolded it and read it aloud, and I will record here what I remember of it. The Duchess of Wynthorpe, née Aldermere, had written in her usual small and precise hand. She wrote that she had been watching her grandson carry the duchy since the age of 19, and had loved him too well to say plainly, while she lived, that she was worried about him. She wrote that the duchy was in excellent order, and the tenants well served, and the accounts immaculate, and that none of this was the point. She wrote that she had gone for a walk in the Ashburn garden in the autumn of some years prior, which she had been doing every October for 40 years, and had found a young woman sitting on the stone bench by the south wall, reading a letter she had been asked to deliver but whose contents distressed her, and working out what to do. She wrote, "I sat down beside her. We talked for 20 minutes. I do not know how to explain. At 81, the particular sensation of meeting someone who is exactly what another person needs, but I have not been wrong about people in a very long time, and I was not wrong about her. She is quiet, without being meek. She reads carefully. She will argue with you when she is right, and she will concede when she is wrong. And that combination, my dear boy, is rarer than you know. She has no money, and no family, and nothing to recommend her to society, and I suspect that when you find her, you will see at once that none of that matters." She wrote, "I asked her if she would be willing to be found. She said she wasn't sure she had a view, since she didn't know you at all. I told her that was entirely the right answer." She wrote, "You will resist. You always resist the things that are good for you. But I have been managing you since you were 4 years old, and I think I know my odds." The Duke folded the letter and sat down. Temperance, beside him, took his hand under the table. She had, I noticed, the same steady gray eyes she'd had in the Ashburn library, unhurried, clear, and seeing exactly what was in front of her. That was the expression, I thought, that the old Duchess had recognized in the garden in October, 3 years before any of the rest of us knew there was anything to recognize. She had, as usual, been right. He did not argue. He never had.